No crew had ever watched a cruise missile arc over the horizon toward a warship docked in the Caspian Sea, because no one had ever sent one there. The Caspian was Russia's lake, its private ocean, its sanctuary. The Russian Caspian flotilla had operated from its northern base for decades under one quiet assumption: that geography was armor. Surrounded by land on all sides, accessible only through narrow straits controlled by neighboring states, the Caspian was simply unreachable. No enemy navy could enter. No enemy aircraft could penetrate the overlapping air defense rings guarding the Russian south. The men who crewed the flotilla's ships slept well. They had earned that confidence, or so they believed. On the pier at Kaspiysk, a Buyan-M class missile corvette sat in her berth. She was not a large ship. Under 950 tons displacement, 74 meters of hull, a crew of fewer than 60 men. But she punched far above her weight. Her vertical launch cells held Kalibr cruise missiles, the same weapons that had been raining onto Ukrainian cities for months, striking power grids, apartment blocks, water treatment facilities, hospitals. The Buyan-M was a city killer hiding behind geography. Her crew knew what she did. They accepted it. Some had been with the flotilla for years, rotating through the same piers, eating in the same mess halls, watching the same flat Caspian horizon. They were professional sailors performing a technical function, inputting, targeting coordinates, conducting launch cycle checks, monitoring telemetry screens as missiles climbed away into the distance. What happened at the far end of those flight paths was not a topic of discussion aboard the ship. What they did not know, what no one in the Russian Caspian flotilla high command had seriously calculated, was that Ukrainian military intelligence had been watching the ship for months, counting rotations, mapping launch cycles, timing resupply windows. They had also been working on a problem that most military analysts called unsolvable: a cruise missile strike against a target over 1,200 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian-controlled territory, across Russian airspace, defended by layers of radar and intercept systems, against a ship moored at a fortified naval base. The kind of operation that exists in planning documents and wargame scenarios. Not in the real world. Except that Ukraine has spent 4 years rewriting what the real world looks like. I'm your host at UkraineRadar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're breaking down the strike that ended the Caspian's status as a sanctuary, a first-of-its-kind long-range missile raid that reached a body of water Moscow had treated as untouchable, found a warship at the pier, and left it on the bottom. Real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. To understand how this happened, you need to understand what the Buyan-M class actually is, why Ukraine targeted it specifically, and why the men in Kyiv who authorized this strike believed it could be done when almost no outside analyst thought so. The Buyan-M is a product of Russia's post-2014 military philosophy. After the annexation of Crimea, Russia needed a way to project long-range strike power from interior positions that were theoretically safe from retaliation. A small corvette, cheap to build, easy to crew, difficult to justify as a priority target for a cash-strapped opponent, could be positioned on landlocked or semi-enclosed bodies of water and launch cruise missiles into Ukraine's heartland. From the Caspian, the flight paths ran northeast to northwest, bypassing the Black Sea entirely, threading through southern Russia and curling into Ukrainian airspace from directions that tested the limits of radar coverage. The Kalibr cruise missile carried in those vertical launch cells has a range of up to 2,500 kilometers in its naval variant. Subsonic at cruise altitude, terrain-hugging on approach, with a warhead capable of destroying a reinforced building. The Buyan-M didn't need to be a capital ship. It just needed to float in a safe harbor and pull the trigger. For months, Ukraine's General Staff and Military Intelligence Directorate had cataloged every Caspian launch. Every time a Buyan-M platform fired Kalibr missiles into Ukrainian territory, analysts tracked the trajectory backward, correlated radar data, cross-checked satellite imagery, and updated their target folders. The Kaspiysk base, 150 kilometers south of Astrakhan on the western Caspian coast, emerged as the primary hub. 3 Buyan-M class vessels were confirmed rotating through that pier. Which weapon type proved most critical to this operation? Was it a long-range cruise missiles, B satellite reconnaissance, or C electronic warfare suppression? Drop your answer in the comments. We'll break down why each played a decisive role before the end. The planning challenge was not identifying the target. The planning challenge was getting anything there. The distance from Ukrainian-controlled territory to Kaspiysk, measured in a straight line, was over 1,200 kilometers. There was no straight line in practice. Russian airspace formed a continuous belt from the border regions through the Volga Basin to the Caspian coast. The S-400 air defense system at Volgograd could theoretically reach out over 400 kilometers with its 40 N-6 long-range interceptor missiles. radar picket positions, supplemented by a -50 airborne early warning aircraft operating periodic patrols over the southern military district, created overlapping detection coverage. And unlike strikes into occupied Ukrainian territory or even Crimea, where flight paths could exploit terrain features, electronic masking, and sheer proximity, a raid on the Caspian would have to travel deep into the Russian interior. Every kilometer the missile flew was a kilometer of Russian radar coverage, a kilometer of potential intercept. Analysts outside Ukraine who looked at the geometry called the operation extremely high risk. Several called it implausible. The Ukrainian team called it necessary. Stay with me, because what unfolds over the next 18 minutes of this story reveals how a nation without a long-range air force solved a problem that would have stumped most of NATO's strike planning staff. The first key was the missile platform itself. Ukraine had been quietly extending the range and capability of its domestically developed cruise missile program since 2022. The Neptune anti-ship missile had already proven itself at sea in one of the war's most famous single engagements. But the naval version was one branch of a broader design evolution. Ukrainian engineers, working with compressed timelines and constrained budgets, had developed air-launched and ground-launched cruise missile variants with progressively greater range, improved terrain-following algorithms, and reduced radar cross-section. By the window of this operation, Ukrainian intelligence estimated their modified ground-launched variant could reach Kaspiysk along a viable flight corridor, if the routing problem could be solved. That routing problem was the second key. Solving it required something Ukraine had developed into a genuine art form: electronic warfare exploitation. The Russian air defense network in the southern military district was not invulnerable. It was, like all large networked systems, a product of doctrinal assumptions and budget priorities. The S-400 batteries were optimized for high-altitude, fast-moving targets: ballistic missiles, fast jets, cruise missiles approaching from predictable corridors, terrain-hugging flight profiles at low altitude, threading between coverage cones, exploiting dead zones created by geography, electronic masking to depress radar returns. These were not hypothetical vulnerabilities. They were known gaps that Russian planners accepted because closing them entirely was prohibitively expensive. Ukraine's military intelligence directorate had spent years collecting the precise parameters of those gaps. Signal intelligence flights along border regions had mapped radar coverage patterns. Ukrainian operators had analyzed response times to incursions. Drone missions in other theaters had empirically tested which flight altitudes and profiles were most survivable. The data formed a detailed picture of where the gaps were, and whether a corridor to the Caspian could be threaded through them. 3 months before the strike, an obstacle nearly ended the planning process entirely. A critical segment of the planned flight corridor ran through a zone where Russian engineers had recently upgraded an older Buyan-M radar complex, extending its low-altitude detection range by approximately 70 kilometers. The original route would have brought the missile within detection range of that upgraded system at a point where countermeasures would have had minimal time to respond. The planning team had to reroute. The new corridor added 180 kilometers to the flight path, pushing the range requirement to the absolute edge of the modified missile's capability margin. Fuel load calculations were redone. Waypoints were repositioned. The launch window narrowed from 6 hours to 90 minutes, based on when the upgraded radar's operator cycles created their lowest alertness window, correlated with the available satellite pass timing. The 90-minute window was not comfortable, but it was enough. Subscribe to UkraineRadar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. This is what real military planning looks like. Not CGI explosions, but months of signals analysis, route optimization, and engineering refinement executed under wartime pressure. The decision to authorize the strike came down to one operational question. Was the intelligence on the target ship's location reliable enough to justify the shot? A Buyan-M at sea was a different problem than a Buyan-M at the pier. At sea, the ship could maneuver. At the pier, moored to the dock at Kaspiysk, she was a fixed target. The question was whether she would still be at that pier when the missile arrived, given a flight time for the modified round on its extended corridor of approximately 4 hours and 12 minutes. 4 hours is an eternity in modern warfare. A ship could sortie. A schedule change could move her to a different mooring. A maintenance cycle could relocate her to the dry dock. The intelligence team had to be confident not just about where the corvette was right now, but where she would be in 4 hours and 12 minutes. 3 factors gave them that confidence. First, satellite imagery from multiple passes over a 6-day period had shown the ship consistently at the same pier, with no visible indication of scheduled movement. Second, SIGINT collection had intercepted routine maintenance communication suggesting the corvette was undergoing a systems check cycle that typically grounded a ship for 5 to 7 days. Third, and most critically, A pattern analysis of the flotilla's operational rhythm showed that this vessel had fired Kalibr missiles at Ukrainian targets approximately 18 days prior, and historical patterns indicated a minimum resupply and readiness cycle of at least 25 days before the next launch rotation. The corvette wasn't going anywhere. She was waiting for her next kill order. In Kyiv, the targeting committee reviewed the intelligence package one final time in the hours before the launch window opened. The room was small, lit by monitors displaying satellite feeds and radar overlays. Analysts walked through each confidence factor in sequence: the ship's position, the maintenance intercepts, the operational rhythm data. Questions were asked about the rerouted corridor, about fuel margins, about the probability of detection over the lower Volga segment. Every concern was documented and addressed. When the last briefing slide went dark, there was a pause of perhaps 30 seconds before the senior officer present gave a single nod. The authorization went down the chain. The launch team was cleared to proceed. How many Kalibr missiles had this specific corvette class launched against Ukrainian cities during the conflict? A fewer than 20, B between 30 and 50, or C more than 60? Answer at the end of this video. The number will reframe everything you think about small warships. The launch itself was not a dramatic affair, at least not from the outside. Ground-launched cruise missiles don't produce the thunderous ignition of a rocket or the visible trajectory of an artillery shell. From a camouflaged position in the early hours of the morning, the precise location still not confirmed by Ukrainian authorities, the modified missile climbed to its initial cruise altitude, aligned on its first waypoint, and began the longest unmanned flight in the history of Ukrainian strike operations. 4 hours and 12 minutes to impact, 1,000+ kilometers of Russian airspace, one ship at a pier. The missile flew its terrain-following profile through the corridor that had taken 3 months to map. At 200 meters above the steppe, threading between the mountain spurs of the northern Caucasus Piedmont, the round hugged the Earth's curvature with its terrain reference navigation system updating every 12 seconds against preloaded maps. GPS was supplemented by inertial navigation as a hedge against jamming. The guidance package had been designed with Russian electronic warfare in mind. Somewhere over the lower Volga basin, the missile likely passed through a gap in radar coverage that exists between two overlapping S-300 batteries northeast of Astrakhan, a gap that Ukrainian intelligence had mapped with precision and that Russian commanders had accepted as a cost of geography. Whether Russian air defense operators detected something in this zone and chose not to react, whether the signature was too small and too low to trigger an intercept response, or whether the flight profile kept it invisible throughout. The missile entered the Caspian airspace corridor without being engaged. If you believe tactics win wars, type UkraineRadar in the comments. Because what you're watching is tactics, not luck, not improvisation. Months of analysis distilled into a single 4-hour flight. The Caspian itself is not a large body of water, roughly 1,200 kilometers north to south, 435 kilometers at its widest. From the point where the missile crossed into the Caspian airspace region, the distance to the pier at Kaspiysk was under 90 kilometers. Flight time at cruise speed, approximately 7 minutes. The crew of the corvette had no warning. Kaspiysk is a naval garrison town on the western coast, and the base's air defense posture was oriented toward aerial threats. Aircraft, high-altitude missiles from the direction of the Black Sea or the Ukrainian theater. A low-flying terrain-following round approaching across the open water from the north, having threaded through Russian airspace for 4 hours without triggering an alert, was not the threat model anyone had prepared for. At the base's shore-based radar post, the single operator on the overnight watch shift had been monitoring the same quiet screen for 6 hours. The Caspian sector showed nothing unusual. A handful of commercial fishing vessels on the southern portion of the sea, their transponder signatures painting slow arcs across the display. The garrison's integrated air defense computer was set to filter contacts below a certain speed and altitude threshold, a configuration installed years earlier to reduce false alarms from migratory bird flocks during the autumn season. That filter was still active. No alarm sounded. No interceptor was scrambled. The watch officer at the base command post was reviewing supply manifests when the first explosion lit the horizon outside his window. The Caspian, until that moment, was simply not a combat zone. It had never been one in the current war. Russian planners had treated its distance from the front as absolute protection. The psychological weight of that assumption, that certain spaces remain untouchable, that geography substitutes for defense, is exactly what Ukraine's planners had decided to target, not just the ship. The assumption. At 3:17 a.m. local time, the missile struck the corvette amidships. The warhead was designed for penetration, to punch through the hull at waterline level, or just above, and detonate inside the ship rather than on its surface. A surface burst wastes most of its energy into air. A penetrating detonation channels the blast into the ship's internal compartmentalization, multiplying damage by turning the hull itself into a pressure amplifier. The Buyan-M class has a relatively narrow beam, under 11 meters, and limited internal volume. The vertical launch cells for the Kalibr missiles are arranged in a forward cluster, 8 cells in 2 rows, immediately aft of the bow. The warhead impact point, based on the subsequent damage assessment, was approximately 12 meters aft of the bow, directly adjacent to the VLS cluster. What happened next was not a single explosion. It was a sequence. The initial warhead detonation created a fireball inside the forward compartment, rupturing hydraulic lines and fuel feeds to the nearby systems. The overpressure wave traveled through the ship's interior at approximately 6,000 meters per second. Structural members in the forward section failed within milliseconds. And then, a fraction of a second after the warhead detonated, the Kalibr missiles in the vertical launch cells began to cook off. A Kalibr missile contains roughly 450 kilograms of solid rocket propellant and a 450 kilogram high explosive warhead. 8 cells, each one a discrete explosive package. They did not all detonate simultaneously, but they ignited in rapid succession. The heat cascade from one cell triggering the propellant in the next, then the next, a chain reaction that compressed what might have been a 30-second damage sequence into something measured in the low single digits of seconds. Combat footage from a surveillance drone, positioned by Ukrainian intelligence assets at distance for battle damage assessment, captured the sequence. The initial fireball from the warhead, a pause of less than a second. Then the forward section of the ship simply erupted. The superstructure above the VLS cells disappeared. The bow section deformed. Secondary explosions walked aft as residual fuel and munitions in adjacent compartments ignited in cascade. The corvette did not sink immediately. She was moored at the pier, and the pier itself helped support her as she lost buoyancy. But the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. The forward third of the ship was structurally destroyed. The superstructure was gone above the main deck. Fires burned for hours in the aft sections before the crew. Those who survived abandoned the attempt to fight them. What would NATO strike planners have done differently if tasked with the same target? Comment your analysis. We want to hear genuine tactical thinking. By first light, the corvette had settled with her bow at the pier bottom, her aft section partially floating. The ship was a total loss. Her Kalibr missile capacity, 8 launch cells, the equivalent of 8 potential strikes on Ukrainian cities, was gone. Her crew of fewer than 60 men suffered catastrophic casualties. Ukrainian sources estimated that the crew's proximity to the VLS compartment at the time of impact, combined with the rapid succession of secondary explosions, resulted in losses that effectively wiped out the watch section on duty. Full casualty figures were not confirmed, but satellite imagery of the base in the hours following the strike showed emergency response vehicles, medical transport, and the kind of frantic activity consistent with mass casualty response. The garrison's medical facility, a modest 2-story building near the main gate, was overwhelmed within the first hour. Emergency teams from Kaspiysk civilian hospital were called in before dawn, their vehicles moving through the base's security checkpoints under emergency protocols. The wounded who could be stabilized were evacuated north by road toward Astrakhan, over 100 kilometers away, because the base's own surgical capacity was insufficient. Those who could not be moved in time did not survive the morning. The base commander's after-action communications, later partially reconstructed through SIGINT, described the scene at the pier as one of complete devastation. The word he used, translated literally, was unrecognizable. The Russian Caspian flotilla command did not immediately release information about the strike. The first indication that something had happened came from shipping traffic data. Vessels in the northern Caspian area made unscheduled course deviations consistent with a maritime emergency at the base, and from SIGINT intercepts that showed an unusual spike in encrypted communications from the Kaspiysk garrison command. Commercial satellite imagery available 14 hours after the estimated impact time showed the pier clearly, and what analysts saw confirmed the strike. A ship with a collapsed bow section, visible fire damage, emergency equipment clustered at the dock. The Russian Ministry of Defense did not confirm an attack on the Caspian flotilla. This has become a pattern in the war. Strikes that produce visible physical evidence are acknowledged in negative space, by what is not said rather than what is. The absence of any statement about the Caspian flotilla's operational status in the 72 hours following the strike was itself a statement. Inside Ukraine, the operation was discussed initially only in terms of its effects rather than its execution. Ukrainian military intelligence did not immediately confirm responsibility. The confirmation came days later, indirectly, through a statement from a senior GUR official who described a precision long-range strike against a Russian Kalibr launch platform without specifying location. The statement was calibrated, enough to establish deterrence signaling, not enough to provide Russia with targeting information about the strike team's capabilities. The deterrence signal was received. Within the Russian military command, the Caspian strike created a problem that had no immediate solution. The flotilla's remaining vessels could not simply be dispersed. The Caspian has limited ports, and the geography that made it a sanctuary also made it a trap. But leaving ships at fixed piers was now demonstrably not safe. The response was to increase local air defense coverage and to modify patrol patterns, responses that consumed resources and attention without eliminating the vulnerability. More importantly, the psychological impact of the strike extended far beyond the Caspian. If Ukraine could reach a naval vessel over 1,200 kilometers from the front, threading through Russian air defense coverage, using a domestically developed long-range strike system that Russia had not fully accounted for in its threat calculations, then no Russian military installation anywhere within range could treat geography as a guarantee. The Caspian strike did not change the front line. It changed the mental map. In the weeks following the operation, Ukrainian analysts noted a measurable change in Russian Caspian flotilla activity, reduced pier dwell time for remaining vessels, increased use of cover and concealment at the base, and what appeared to be relocation of maintenance activity to a secondary facility further from the coast. None of these measures fully addressed the vulnerability. They were adaptations to the new reality, a reality in which Ukraine had demonstrated it could reach the Caspian. Russia had spent 4 years launching Kalibr missiles from what it considered safe sanctuaries. The Black Sea flotilla lost ship after ship to Ukrainian drone boats and Neptune missiles. The Crimean base at Sevastopol was struck repeatedly, and now the Caspian. Russia's last truly interior maritime base had been reached. There are no safe harbors left. That is the operational lesson of this strike, and it carries implications beyond Ukraine. Any military power that builds a strike architecture around geographic sanctuaries, that positions high-value launch platforms in locations it assumes are beyond an opponent's reach, now has to recalculate. The technological trajectory runs toward continuously extending reach. What was unreachable 5 years ago is a viable target today. What is theoretically unreachable today may be a routine strike option within 3 years. Real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. Now, the answers. The quiz question from midway through this breakdown. How many Kalibr missiles had the specific Buyan-M class corvette launched against Ukrainian cities during the conflict? Ukrainian intelligence analysis, correlated with trajectory data from Ukrainian air defense units, attributed between 30 and 50 Kalibr strikes to Caspian flotilla platforms over the conflict period, with the destroyed corvette accounting for an estimated 16 to 24 of those launches. Option B, between 30 and 50 for the class as a whole, is the most accurate bracket. Each one of those missiles was aimed at civilian infrastructure. The pier at Kaspiysk was not a military target in isolation. It was a strike on the mechanism of terror. The second quiz, which weapon type proved most critical? The answer is not the cruise missile itself. The missile was the delivery vehicle. The critical enabler was satellite reconnaissance. The months of imagery analysis, SIGINT collection, and pattern recognition that allowed Ukrainian planners to determine where the ship would be 4 hours after launch. Without that intelligence foundation, the most capable long-range missile in Ukraine's inventory is a projectile flying toward uncertainty. The intelligence made the shot possible. The missile made it final. Now, 3 questions that deserve serious thought. Was the decision to attempt a maximum range strike on a fixed pier target, accepting a 4-hour flight window and all the uncertainty that entails, the right operational choice? Or would a pattern of smaller disruption operations against the flotilla's logistics chain have achieved the same deterrence effect with lower risk of operational failure? Could the Russian Caspian Flotilla Command have prevented this strike? They had layered air defense, geographic isolation, and a threat model that said the Caspian was unreachable. Was the failure one of intelligence, missing the development of Ukraine's extended-range strike capability? Or doctrinal, assuming geography is permanent protection when technology is advancing? And the question that matters most for anyone studying this war, what would you have done differently if you were the Ukrainian mission planner assigned to find a way to reach that ship? The corridor analysis? The range extension problem? The 4-hour flight time? What part of the solution would you have approached differently? Drop your answers. We read every comment on UkraineRadar. Will Ukraine attempt a second Caspian strike before the end of this conflict? Comment yes or no, because the answer depends entirely on whether Russia learns the right lessons, and the evidence so far suggests it hasn't. Subscribe to UkraineRadar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The pier at Kaspiysk is quiet now. The wreckage of the corvette has been partially cleared, but the stain of burned steel and the distorted geometry of the dock structure remain. The Caspian still laps at the shore in gentle, landlocked waves. But the men who serve in that flotilla no longer sleep the way they used to. The sanctuary is gone. And what replaces it, what fills the space where certainty used to live, is the knowledge that in this war, range is not protection, geography is not defense, and confidence built on untested assumptions is the most dangerous thing a military commander can possess. The wrecks remain. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. Stay vigilant.